Hello and welcome to this special edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Every year at this time, to mark Remembrance Week, we would reach out to our friend Dr. Tim Cook. He was the chief historian at the Canadian War Museum, a prolific writer, 1920 books, and he'd almost always just written one, so we'd talk to him about whatever stories he had captured. In The Secret History of Soldiers, he shared what so many of our veterans found impossible to say aloud. So there were the quiet admissions of surviving against all odds in circumstances we can't even imagine. He captured the true meaning of service in Vimy, the battle and the legend. And in the fight for history, Tim reminded us all that a nation's history is built on its past and always on the backs of those who were willing to go to war, to risk it all, to create and save and build a nation and the ideas at its core. Tim told the war fighters' stories with passion and with details, and he gave so many of these men and women faces and names and reminded us that they had too often been denied the status of heroes and nation builders that they truly were. He was a great friend to Canada and to the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces because he gave that voice to thousands from the grave, from the battlefields and bridges, and of course from the cockpits. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Andrew Burtch. He is the post-1945 historian at the Canadian War Museum. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Written 4 books at least on his own. He's a lecturer at Carleton. And at the end of this conversation, we will be posting a link not only to this conversation, but to, of course, all the other previous podcasts we've done with Tim Cook. And also, we're going to add there the tribute that I paid to Dr. Cook in the Senate upon learning of his death. So welcome, Dr. Burtch. You were a friend, a colleague, a collaborator with Tim. Where did his passion come from? You know him better than many.
Well, I met him, I think, first in 2002, shortly after he'd been hired, and when I was quite anxious to be hired at a certain point. He was just immediately so kind and welcoming, and then of course I found out he'd won the C.P. Stacey Prize for his book "No Place to Run" about gas warfare,
As
and
have you. I'm just going to add, as have you in 2012. Go ahead.
he certainly paved the way, I will say. But I know that he comes from a bit of a line of storytellers. His mother, Sharon Cook, is a teacher. His father, a longtime archivist. Turns out my dad knew him. It's a bit of a small world that Ottawa is, and I think that really did cement for him the importance of those first person accounts, those archival sources. And it was just his passion. I remember talking about hobbies and that, at the office and saying, oh, thinking of getting into origami. And he's like, it's just history for me, buddy. Like he would wake up and do history. He'd go to bed and do history, and he would
Yeah.
read and he would write, and he just had that drive, and it was innate to him in the same way that other people may take up fly fishing or whittling or something. History was always Tim's passion, and he never deviated from that course the entire time I knew him.
It's the detail. When I talk about him being able to give them faces and names and hearts and souls, like that was kind of the difference. He was able to pull that out of his written word. And this is hard history, I mean, we're seeing the last of the World War II generation now, down to a very few.
Mhm.
So it's a tough job to find that. It wasn't recorded in the way it is today.
I think that the advantage that Tim had, and having worked in the archives and knew a lot of those sources, he knew how to navigate them. His unique talent, of course, was not to take the kind of dry, sometimes bureaucratic language in which defense and wars are fought and won in many cases on these slips of paper, but he really focused on the letters and the diaries and the personal things that people were writing home about, and this was really fed into the mission of the Canadian War Museum, who I don't think they knew what they got when they hired him back in 2002. They pulled the institution along with him in many respects, but he was able to really showcase how these were ordinary people in extraordinary times. That he was these were people who, as he wrote about in the Secret History of Soldiers, at times railed against the machine that they were caught in. They didn't want necessarily to be in those conditions, and yet
Exactly.
they made the most of it to the degree they can. They wanted to survive, they wanted to get home, and those feelings are just pour out of these letters, these accounts, oral histories later. And Tim had a real talent for combining the kind of grand sweep with the very I'll say low level, but really most important level on the ground, on the ships, in the aircraft, to say that this was, how are you going to bridge these terrible obstacles? And they did so with their bodies.
Yeah.
And it's something that he felt very passionately about, and he was so talented at relating. It made every day working with him an experience. He never let that target drop. It wasn't about,
Yeah.
there's budgets and there's work plans and all that sort of stuff, but the
Yeah.
mission was always research. It was always telling the stories, and that was just hammered home time and time and time again. I'm very fortunate to have worked with him for so long, and to have been welcomed to a certain degree into his circle, and seeing his success has been so
Yeah.
gratifying, and seeing the tributes that have poured out from around Ottawa, from around Canada.
Yeah.
There's a fellow who's in the United Nations headquarters in Korea who wrote to me and said that his work was significant and wanted to pay tribute. So his touch and the spread and value that people saw in his work was not just in Canada, but I think around the world. Scholars and soldiers and others just really resonated with them.
I love that you called him a warrior with words, right? The
Yeah.
to tell the stories, because he really combined those two things of sort of history and the facts with the memoir side of things. Like memoirs are different than history, but he merged
Mm-hmm.
the two so that we got three-dimensional history, in a way. You worked with him on one of the projects about sort of the medical aspects and what we learned
Mm.
from war, and I think you collaborated on that. How does that process work? You guys are kind of a strange bunch to the outside world here.
Well, that exhibition was it arrived in 2011, I believe we opened it, and it was a really interesting collaboration that came to us kind of conceived and developed by folks at the Deutsches Hygiene Museum in Dresden and the Wellcome Collection in London. So there was this kind of uh, you know European and British collaboration about the history of military medicine dating back to the Crimean War right up to kind of present day, at that time Afghanistan and Iraq. And so we took this project, and we realized the costs and challenges of moving all this stuff from London. We looked in our own collection at places like the Oslo Museum of Medicine in McGill, where there was the original copy of John McCrae's in Flanders Fields. We looked at, I think there's a medical museum in London, Ontario. We looked for all sorts of sources where we can say, okay, here are the themes, the way that this has been built. How can we populate it with Canadian stories? And so we kind of divvied it up. So he would kind of take the Second World War and before, and I would kind of take the Cold War and after. And then we kind of would as we'd find interesting things, we'd fire it to each other. Among the things we found were stories about the pathology samples that were collected from
Yeah.
Canadian soldiers, which of course he then turned into lifesavers and body snatchers
And
down the
I
road.
remember the conversation we had about that. It was gruesome, but it was fascinating. And to think that this was a whole other level of contribution that these men and women who served made,
Mm-hmm.
unbeknownst to them.
Well, we were so interested in that it had pathology samples. I don't know that we would do it today. I think there's some more
Right.
sensitivity about some of the displays of human remains, but it was we were working with the curators on the other side of the Atlantic, and they were saying that the German pathology samples that were on display were part of a propaganda display to say, okay, it's grisly, but here is the treatment that's being offered to your soldiers.
Right.
And the idea of pathology being used to improve medical service, this idea that medicine is advancing in leaps and bounds during war because it is so such an awful machine that
Yeah.
devastates human bodies and minds. And this is a way that they responded to that, to ways to improve survivability. And yet, for the way that they operated, the contradiction there was that they were patching people up to go back into that grinder. And so there were ethical questions that were coming out there. So we'd have these conversations and we'd just find these great stories, nurses' notebooks and artworks and personal accounts and materials from family members that we just felt it was a very grisly subject to work on,
Yeah.
but it was a lot of fun to populate it with him and to go on tours with him and kind of craft how we're going to divide things up and who would talk about the venereal disease section with whom and that sort of thing. It was a very interesting show. And I think it's the only exhibition that I co-curated with
Yeah.
him. But there wasn't a single show that I worked on that he didn't kind of come over and say, "Oh, what you working on?" And he would take an interest. He was not just about his own projects. He was always about, even before he became the chief historian and director, he always was curious what his colleagues were working on, ways that they could kind of improve it. What are the stories? He always wanted to hear the stories. And
Yeah.
it was such it really did light a fire under you to say that, okay, well, the work I'm doing is important. We know it. We hear it from the public. We hear it from, but as a colleague, someone who has that national profile to come around the corner and say, hey, what you doing?
Yeah.
It was just, it was a real
Well, and
blessing.
he
Yeah.
was interested even in conversations with people like me that he speaks to, right? I mean, he was always, if I told a story about family or something that related to the military, he'd quiz me on it, right? So
Yes,
he
exactly.
was always researching. I'll just say at this moment, honestly, I think the biggest tribute we could pay to Tim is for everybody out there to go and buy his books and read them. And I'm going to add your books to that list now, Dr. Andrew Burtch, and that's Burtch. See how I'm helping there?
Thank you.
Because they really have captured parts. Well, we wouldn't be here as a country without the wars that have been waged and the victories that our men and women assured and guaranteed. The the I want to come to some of the things you're working on too, because you, and I think this was award winning, you did a book back in 2012, Give Me Shelter, The Failure of Canada's Cold War Civil Defense. And that just struck me when I was looking at it, because of course we're in unprecedented times in terms of where the reshifting on the global stage. And when President Trump started musing the other day after meeting with China about talking about restarting nuclear testing and whatnot, then when I saw this reference, I thought you've studied this about our readiness or lack thereof when it
Mhm.
comes to this. Is it time to rethink this again?
It's a really interesting question, and I always am interested to see when there's periodic reports that come out of the Senate or come out of the House of Commons looking into things like preparedness. And some of it could have been written in 1951 in terms of that there's different levels of government. They're not necessarily working together. There's
Are
a
we
dispute
still
whether
supposed to get under our desks? Like, is that the plan?
I mean, if it makes you feel better, I think the advantage of getting under one's desk in part was informed by the Halifax explosion, which is don't be near the windows,
Yes, yes,
where so
yes.
many were blinded. Horrible event. But it is comical to think that this is an answer to something as world changing as a
Right.
nuclear bomb. It creates such a we live in this system that's built on systems that are built on systems that we don't fully understand and get. The infrastructure of our modern lives is such that the slightest thing can upset it, and a nuclear bomb will upset many of them. So having the capacity to manage those systems to create some continuity is something that the government, I think, is invested in, should be invested in. I don't know that it'll ever be enough, and that was the problem with the reason civil defense failed is as a concept was that Canada has been so far away from harm for so long.
Hmm.
We have experienced, hardship and loss and landings on by German submarines on the coast during the wars. But these were isolated events. They weren't an existential threat. So every time that there's talk about, well, we should look at what the Finns have done or the Swedes have done. Well, the wolf is at the door for them. They're right
Yeah.
next door, and they have things like building codes that are changed and these sorts of things. When we tried to do that here, municipalities charged as home improvements. So like your property tax would go up. So of course people wouldn't build, or they,
Wouldn't do
you
it.
know, it was, and it's very, very, it's a very devilish problem. And how do you solve it? So it was a really interesting project, and I've managed to work with folks at the Diefenbunker and talk to them about their. I
Yeah,
was there last week on a tour with them. They do such fantastic work out there,
yeah,
and I was able to, talk with them about kind of on the tour, okay, we're 15 minutes in. By this point, a submarine launched ballistic missile would have hit. We're 30
right.
minutes in. Okay, now the ICBMs have come. The time scale and the devastation is something that during the Cold War, people had to think about during crises like the Berlin crisis or the Cuban Missile Crisis or other flare ups. But you couldn't sustain that level of vigilance for long. You go crazy.
Yeah.
So it is a psychological burden to be prepared. So the best you can do is just, have enough food and water and these sorts of things. But even that is a message that takes drumming into. So it's as for, nuclear testing, of course, that was a big place that people mobilized around because of
Yeah.
around health issues. Give a tooth to science. The strontium 90 buildup that would occur through radiation. We all have a bit of the bomb in us now as a
Yeah.
result of those tests. So I don't think anyone's eager to see the resumption of those from an environmental perspective. But I gather that it might be a show, and so it might be something that may attract attention, and maybe that's the reasoning behind it. I'm not sure.
Well, in the current world too, I mean, we've all just gone through dealing with the pandemic, and the state of our unpreparedness could not have been more obvious, right up
Hmm.
to including destroying all the masks and the stuff we had sitting around from SARS-1. But just it was amazing to see. I lived in New York after 9/11.
Mm.
We barely had cell phones. It was the BlackBerry, and we realized how crucial communication was then, and also just like little things. You should have water in your house and keep some cash and small bills. Like, we can't all build a bunker, but we have to be thinking about what would happen if.
Yeah. I think the thing that was encouraging in my research, a lot of it's grim, but a lot of the studies that people were preparing for panic control was this idea that, the second that the bomb goes off, it's Mad Max and everyone's out for themselves, and there's going to be,
Right.
but every single occasion where there's a natural disaster, every single occasion like 9/11, communities come out to help each other.
Yeah. That was
And
astounding, yeah, to watch
so
that.
that to see that, and so that actually becomes a risk for an atomic bomb, because then you are, of course, people are converging on the site where there's a lot of radiation, so you want to maybe keep them away. How do you do that? But the idea is that I think that the idea that it would immediately fall apart is I think mistaken, as we've seen through people coming together during the early stages of the pandemic. In particular, you saw that you couldn't be together, but people, banging their pots and pans, trying to express some sort of
Yeah.
appreciation for the work that was being done, trying to making sacrifices on a personal level that were profound. That we saw that happen. So I think there's a desire to help out. I don't think it's a we're selfish or foolish or
Right.
any of those sorts of things. It's not a judgment on the population, but what we're being asked to do in the case of a nuclear bomb is so outside of our frame of reference
Yeah.
that it as true in the 1960s as it is today. The benefit is we don't think about nuclear weapons as much these days because the Cold War is over, but of course the nukes are still with us.
Yes, yes. And you don't think about it, as you say. For us, we have the luxury of not being on the front line. I mean, we could talk about the Arctic and the North, but we're not in Ukraine or Poland, although
Yeah.
we've got troops in Latvia, of course. Um, Great. Just a wonderful set of insights. Give me shelter, the failure of Canada's Cold War civil defense. And I love the Rolling Stone reference there too. For the younger generations, they won't know, but honestly, go look it up. Your your current project is also fascinating because this year marks 75 years since the beginning of the Korean War. And you have used modern technology. You've gone out there and done a Google map of where the Canadian soldiers who served in Korea, where they fell. It's just amazing. So just tell us a little bit. Talk about putting a human face on the fallen to give families in the country that kind of knowledge. Where'd this come from?
Well, it came from my daily work at the museum. I would often get questions about saying, well, how many Canadians passed away in Korea? And the answer is 516. And then people would say, well, how many of them died in combat? And so that's 312. Okay. How did the rest of them die? And that was something that I didn't have an answer for right away. So I decided, in between other tasks, other exhibitions and other things, to go to the library and archives and start to request their personnel files
Hmm.
because they would have the cause of death listed there. And the library and archives were very accommodating, and they actually at one point I would give them tranches of 50 files at a time to go through,
Wow.
and they would bring them out, and then you're seeing all this great detail about, well, who were they? They were millwrights or boilermakers or teachers or and you'd have photos of them when they're 19. Some of them are Second World War veterans. Some of them are grizzled and older. One of them was on a merchant marine ship that got off in uh, from Guyana and went straight from St. John, New Brunswick to Japan and Korea. And he died of a heart attack in Korea in Japan in
Amazing.
1954. So these stories came out, and then you'd also have in them grid references. So you'd have sometimes you would say, well, they passed away in the U.S. training camp in Washington. They'd be there, or they'd be in Canoe River, the train crash out in the West Coast that 17 gunners died in. Or in one case, someone enlisted for Korea, left the armory, and had a heart attack. They had signed up for Korea, so they still count.
Incredible.
So about 170 of those deaths occur here in Canada or the United States or in Japan. And then you have the rest of them who are located in Korea. So I took those grid references, and then I was able to go from period maps, learn how to read them, and then I was able to kind of translate that data into the kind of approximate locations where they would be. And I've just dropped them on a pin on Google Map and Google Earth, and then they're there. So I've exported the data, and it's searchable. And I've had lots of people come out and say, "Hey, do you know anything about my uncle, or do you know anything about that?" And so I have all the personnel files all photographed, and so I can just say, here, I'll drop it on a Google Drive, or I'll send it to you. And some of these people had no idea. Their families were never told. They only had 3 photographs were sent home of their grave sites in Korea. Just glossy photos of a simple cross in a field in Busan. And Korea was so far away and people knew so little about it that, of course, they never visited. But now you go to Busan, into that cemetery, and it's just maintained so meticulously by the South Korean government and by the United Nations. It is a real site of remembrance that it's a shame that as many people haven't had the chance to go. But veterans have gone there every year since the
Yeah,
70s
they're
to pay their
very
tribute.
active, and I know many that still make the trip in their 80s and 90s because
Yeah.
it was a war that never got its place in history either. That's the other
Yeah.
thing is kind of,
That came
yeah,
much later, and that's one of the things that Tim and I worked on. He kind of took his fight for history approach, and we said, well, let's look at the advocacy of the Korea veterans and how
mhm,
they kind of weren't welcomed into that body of veterans immediately, how they had to fight for their own place and did successfully.
yeah,
And that was a real pleasure to work with him on as well. I should say, though, I've had the privilege of seeing Tim's CV, and I know that his latest book, The Good Allies, which was nominated for
yeah,
a Gelber Prize, and as a terrific look at that relationship. I don't think it will necessarily be the last piece that we see from Tim, because he had a number of irons in the fire that are coming forward to publication later. So, including one that we worked on about the veterans experience, similar to our collaboration on the collected essays on Korean history. It'll be about the veterans experience from the Second World War to the present, and that reflects his latest effort to launched the In Their Own Voices program, which was an oral history program, and he was a big champion of getting those stories down, and so we're able to relate a few more of those. So
yeah,
we'll see
and
more from Tim
yeah,
because
I
he was
think
so
so too.
prolific.
Yeah, I really think so too. But because you know, and because your work was shared, you'll continue to do that too because it's Korea, and then we go on to Afghanistan, and there are um, many, many stories to be told there too. Andrew, thank you so much for doing this today and helping us mark Remembrance Week and to always keep those who served front and center in our minds. If we don't learn from history, then we're going to make the same mistakes again. We know all of that, but it also we need to be reminded that all of the sacrifice that these men and women made give us the ability to sit here today and have this conversation and to do it in freedom and to do it in peace. So really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for your interest and for your advocacy. It's
Oh,
for people who are interested in history that we do what we do.
oh, it's just great. So, Dr. Burtch, a historian at the Canadian War Museum, I love this that you're kind of the post 45 historian on because that means, a good chunk of my life is history. You're making me feel very old today. But the Canadian War Museum is an amazing place, and whenever people come to visit here in Ottawa, it's a trip I insist they make. And the last time I had two Korean War vets visiting here, they went, and having that experience was just mind-blowing for them. So anybody who comes to the nation's capital should, yes, go to Parliament Hill, but they should go to the Canadian War Museum as well. And just before we say goodbye, a reminder again that we're just going to try and make it easy for you. We're going to repost links to the conversations we've had on this podcast over the last few years with Tim. Of course, I talked to him many years in my earlier life too. We're going to post the tribute that I offered to Tim in the Senate of Canada, and then you'll have the benefit of this conversation with Dr. Burtch as well. So on Remembrance Day, just for those who have fallen, for those who have given all, take a moment and remember how they gave us our life today. Thank you all. We'll see you again very soon.